everyone! We're here today to share some of the awesome books that we read during the month of June. Each of us have a few to share with you today, so let's just get right into it.
So the first book that I want to talk about today is Gunslinger Girl by Lyndsay. So this is obviously a Western, but it takes place in the future after some environmental collapse has happened, as well as the Second Civil War in the United States. Our main character, Serendipity Jones, lives in a sort of compound with her father, and he's a very strict man and is quite abusive towards her. And she finally has the last straw when he decides to sell her off as a bride to somebody. And that night, her and her best friend decide to run away. Once Serendipity and her friend run away, some really traumatic events happen, some really violent things happen. And one thing that I appreciated about this book is it doesn't just sweep it under the rug as if it never happened. It clearly affects Serendipity, and I think it's like a really accurate representation of something like PTSD. It doesn't just go away overnight. So that was just one thing I appreciated about the story. But anyways, so Serendipity ends up at this other kind of town called Cessation, which is a really decadent but lawless town. So Serendipity is actually extremely talented when it comes to sharpshooting. She learned this from her mother. And when she reaches this town, she's taken in by the theater troupe there, and she becomes a performer in the show. But this book also has a ton of political intrigue and corruption, and Serendipity ends up right in the middle of it. So while I went into this novel just expecting a kind of fun Western, it was actually a lot more than that, and it was just fantastic. So this book actually doesn't come out until January of next year, but I highly recommend putting on your TBR lists.
So the first book I'm going to talk about is Wild by Cheryl Strayed. Now this is obviously a wildly popular book that had a movie come out a couple years ago, but I was shockingly impressed by how good it was. If you didn't know, this book is about Cheryl's journey hiking the Pacific Crest Trail all alone in her 20s. As somebody who grew up outside and doing a lot of hiking and things like that, reading about Cheryl's journey as a kind of an amateur hiker was really interesting, and I really appreciated her perseverance. I spend a lot of time in this book flashing back to the reasons why Cheryl decides to hike the trail. A lot of tragic things happen in her past. At 22 she loses her mother, and then her life kind of goes spiraling out of control. I really appreciated how she very candidly discusses things like her divorce from her husband, who she clearly loves, her dabbles in heroin and getting addicted to drugs, and how making a snap decision to hike the trail changed her life. At the beginning, she is wildly unprepared, and it's just fascinating to see her actually push through and complete her goals, and all of these wonderful characters that she meets throughout the journey are just so charming, and it almost read like a novel at times. Sometimes you do forget that this is actually a memoir and this actually happened. If you like memoirs and looking for a fascinating new book, I would definitely pick up Wild by Cheryl Strayed.
My first book this month is The Peculiar Incident on Shady Street by Lindsay Currie. The main character of this book is 12-year-old Tessa, who at the beginning of the story has to move all the way from Florida in the sunshine where all her friends live to cloudy, rainy, gloomy Chicago. Not only that, but her parents have bought the spookiest house on Shady Street. From the moment she moves in, creepy, spooky, weird things start to happen that seem as though something or someone is trying to communicate with her. Luckily, Tessa meets a great new group of friends at school, one of whom happens to be an expert on all of Chicago's most famous ghost stories. And with their help, she starts to be able to piece together why all of these spooky things are happening to her in her house. I thought this story was a great split between being a friendship story and a ghost story with just the right amount of creep for a middle grade novel. This book comes out this October.
Another book that I absolutely loved this month was The Weight of Feathers by Anne-Marie McLemore. I read this book really slowly throughout the entire month of June, and I actually think that it was a really the perfect way to read it, because the writing in this book is so beautiful. I just kind of wanted to read a chapter or two and savor what I had just read and really let it sink in. So I think it just caused me to really appreciate the overall story so much more. So this is a book told in two different perspectives. Our main characters are actually part of two rival families who have been fighting for over a generation. Both families are traveling performers in competing kind of circus shows. So one character, Lace, is part of the Paloma family, and their family travel around and perform as mermaids in lakes and rivers. And then the other main character, named Cluck, his family they're called the Corbeaus, and they are traveling tightrope walkers. So they kind of dress up as angels, and they'll tightrope walk amongst all of the highest trees in the town. So I thought that was just such a cool concept for a story. I've never really read anything like that. So this story is kind of like a Romeo and Juliet type story, where the two teens from the different families obviously meet and form a relationship, but it's filled with really stunning magical realism, which I love. And the story is just so intricate, and it kind of deals with events that have happened in the past as well as what's happening in the current day, and it's just stunning. Like, I can't recommend it enough. Her writing is just so descriptive and lush, and if you like authors like Maggie Stiefvater or Laini Taylor, then she's right up there, so highly recommend.
Next, I have The Blade Itself, which is the first book in the First Law trilogy by Joe Abercrombie. Now, I definitely picked this up because it's kind of considered a modern fantasy classic. This came out over 10 years ago now, and it's something in the fantasy community that people always talk about and I hadn't gotten to yet. This first book is a little bit hard to describe because it's definitely character driven, which is something you don't see very often in high fantasy. Not a whole lot actually happens in this book, but we do follow three very interesting points of view. We have Glokta, who is this very morally ambiguous, doesn't even begin to describe it, I think, character who, when he was younger, was so severely tortured that he is just very physically disabled. He also is now a torturer. So after going through all of this horrible stuff in his youth, he has now flipped the switch and is kind of the one inflicting the damage. And then we have my favorite point of view, which is Logan Ninefingers, who is a man who only has 9 fingers. And he is kind of a down on his luck 30-something crazy warrior man who is just has a bit of a wry sense of humor, but his point of view is just so interesting to me. He quickly reveals that he's lost his entire family, all of his wife and children are dead, and his whole village is gone. And then we have Giselle, who is a spoiled army brat who isn't very talented or particularly fit, and in this book he has been entered into a sort of sword fighting competition that he is required to win, and it's he's just so interesting to read about because he's super just full of himself, likes to drink and gamble, and then he meets a woman in here that kind of convinces him to change his ways. Like I said, for a high fantasy, not a lot of plot going on in here, but I think it is an awesome setup for the next 2 books in the series.
The next book on my list is Supermax and the Mystery of Thornwood's Revenge by Susan Vaught. This book was not at all what I was expecting, which was a classic spooky ghost story, but I really enjoyed it. Instead, this story revolves around what happens when a computer hacker uses social media and the internet to basically bully an entire town, starting with our main character's grandfather, who also happens to be the town sheriff. There is a slightly spooky element that ties the whole story together, involving an abandoned mansion and a local town legend. But what really drew me into this story was Max. Max is 12 years old and has been in a wheelchair since she broke her back at the age of 4 in a car accident. She's a total electronics whiz, and she's constantly making adjustments to her chair, trying to upgrade it and make it even faster and cooler, but they often don't go as planned. Max hasn't had an easy life and definitely has a chip on her shoulder, which often results in angry outbursts and pushing people away that really just want to be there for her. But despite that, or possibly because of that, I felt like Susan Vaught just did this fantastic job of rounding her out and representing her voice, and you really understand where she's coming from, and I just thought she was such a fantastic character. And then, of course, on top of all of that, it is a fantastic mystery story. I don't want to reveal a lot more of the plot to you because I really just liked the way that it unfolded, and like I said, I was very surprised by the whole book, but I 100% recommend this. This book comes out in September.
And my absolute favorite book that I read this month was The Cruel Prince by Holly Black. So this is the story of a girl named Jude, and at the very beginning of the book, her parents are murdered and her sisters are kidnapped and taken to the fairy realm. So for pretty much the first half of this book, it really follows Jude's kind of struggles to fit in with the different fairies in this world. A lot of them don't like her because she's mortal and they think that she's kind of less than them. But Jude also kind of like really wants to make a home there, and she gets really into like battle and swordmanship and things like that. And then one of the different princes in this kind of royal family decides to take her on as a spy. Once she becomes a spy for this prince, things get crazy. The political intrigue in this book is absolutely amazing. It's so intricate without being confusing, and if you like kind of like watching Game of Thrones, you'll probably really enjoy this. It's extremely violent and bloody, and all of the characters are morally ambiguous. No one is black and white. Even the side characters are like really well developed, which I appreciated, and there's a little bit of romance in here that is just like so sexy. It just had everything. I literally stayed up all night reading this because I absolutely could not put it down. Anytime I had to take a break, I was just thinking about it. And yeah, it was just one of the best books I've read all year, and it was my first Holly Black book, and I am excited to pick up more from her because this was a total gem. This book also sadly doesn't come out until January of next year, but it is worth waiting for.
Next, I have Unearthed by Amie Kaufman and Meagan Spooner. Now this was a really excellent read that I was entirely surprised by. In this book, Earth is experiencing environmental collapse and a lack of resources. And one day, Earth intercepts a coded message from what they think is an extinct alien race that reveals that they might have technology that can save Earth. This book follows two points of view, one of which who is Jules, and he is the son of a scholar, and he has gone to this alien planet, which is called Gaia, in hopes of studying the new technology rather than using it, because he's not sure that it's actually going to be good for planet Earth. The other point of view is Mia, who is a scaver, and scavers are scavengers, and she goes to Gaia in order to steal this new technology in order to sell it on the black market to get money to save her sister. At the very beginning of this book, Jules and Mia meet up and kind of form an unlikely alliance as they are on opposite sides of the situation, and they end up having to work together to get through a temple to find this new technology. This book was super fun and very fast-paced, and it's being marketed as kind of a sci-fi Indiana Jones, and I totally get that vibe from this. Jules and Mia solve all sorts of interesting puzzles and problems, and you just want to keep reading more, and I would definitely recommend picking up this book when it comes out in January of 2018.
My final book this month is Sidetracked by Diana Harmon Asher. I am definitely a sucker for an underdog story, and I just loved this book. Our main character is Joseph, who is the tiniest kid in class and does not have a lot of friends, and on top of all of that, he also struggles with ADD. On his first day of 7th grade, Joseph encounters Heather, the new girl, who is tall and fast and better at sports than all of the boys in her gym class. It does not go over very well for her. Later that day, however, it turns out that Joseph's resource room teacher has started a brand new, never before at their school track team. Despite Joseph's real lack of athletic ability, he and Heather both end up on the track team. A lot of the other kids on this team have never made the cut for sports teams at school before either, but Mrs. T is fantastic. Basically, the only rule is, as long as you're trying, you're a part of the team. It's not about beating the other kids or proving yourself better than anyone else. You just have to beat your own personal best. I thought the book did an awesome job of exploring and breaking down gender norms, and it's just a fantastic friendship story, all about finding your place and doing your best. Can't recommend it enough. This book comes out in August. So that's what we've read this month, but as always, we would love to hear what you've been reading. You can always leave it in the comments below.
Please like this video and subscribe to our channel. Happy reading, and thanks for being awesome. Goodbye!
Bye.